You're sitting on your couch right now, maybe with a coffee going cold beside you, scrolling your phone while something streams in the background. You coughed this morning and didn't think twice about it. Maybe you popped an ibuprofen. Maybe you gargled salt water and moved on with your day. You live in a world where a sore throat is an inconvenience, where a fever is something you manage between emails, where the worst-case scenario is a trip to urgent care and a prescription you pick up at a drive-through window. Now rewind 5,000 years. You're in a Neolithic village, maybe 60 people total, and 3 of them started coughing yesterday. By tonight, 1 of them is dead. By the end of the week, half your village can't stand up. There is no word for virus. There is no concept of contagion. There is no medicine, no hospital, no doctor, not even a theory for why this is happening. All you know is that the air itself seems to have turned against you. So the question is simple. For tens of thousands of years, with no germ theory, no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no understanding of what disease even was, how did ancient humans survive pandemics at all? Here's where most people get it wrong. They assume pandemics are a modern problem. They picture the Black Death, maybe the 1918 flu, and they think infectious disease on a massive scale is something that came with cities and trade routes and crowded ships. But disease was killing humans long before any of that, long before writing, long before agriculture, long before we even settled down in one place. Your ancestors were fighting invisible enemies from the very beginning. They just didn't know the enemy was invisible. The oldest evidence we have of epidemic disease in humans goes back far further than most people realize. In 2018, researchers from the University of Copenhagen analyzed ancient DNA from a 5,000-year-old mass grave site in Frelsegården, Sweden. What they found floored the archaeological world. Yersinia pestis, plague, the same bacterial family that would later cause the Black Death, was already circulating among Neolithic Europeans around 3000 BCE. And the burial pattern told a chilling story. Dozens of bodies laid down at the same time, in the same place, with no signs of violence. These people weren't killed by war. They were killed by something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't run from. But here's the part that doesn't make sense until you think about it. That Swedish grave wasn't a one-off. Similar mass burial anomalies show up across Europe from roughly the same period, scattered across what is now Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. Something was sweeping across the continent, and it was happening at a very specific moment in human history, right when people were making the biggest lifestyle change our species had ever attempted. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming didn't just change what people ate. It changed everything about how disease worked. Picture this. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors lived in small, mobile bands. 30 people, maybe 50. They moved constantly, following game and seasons, rarely staying in one place long enough for waste to accumulate or water to go bad. If someone got sick, the group was so small and so spread out that a pathogen couldn't find enough new hosts to sustain itself. The disease would burn through a handful of people and then simply die out. Your nomadic ancestors weren't immune to illness. They were just bad targets. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, everything changed. People started planting crops. They domesticated wheat and barley. They settled down, and for the first time in human existence, large groups of people started living in the same place, permanently, surrounded by their own waste, their stored grain, their animals, and each other. Sites like Çatalhöyük in southern Turkey, one of the world's oldest known settlements dating to around 7500 BCE, show us what this looked like. Thousands of people packed into mud brick houses built wall to wall, with no streets between them. People entered their homes through holes in the roof. The dead were buried under the floors they slept on. Livestock lived close enough to share breath with. Think about that for a second. You went from a species that never stayed put to a species that slept on top of its dead and lived shoulder to shoulder with goats. Disease didn't just have an opportunity. It had a paradise. The Neolithic demographic transition, as researchers call it, the population boom that came with farming, created exactly the conditions pathogens need: density, proximity to animals, contaminated water, grain stores that attracted rats and insects. For the first time, diseases could jump from animals to humans and then spread from human to human fast enough to become epidemics. Zoonotic spillover, the moment a pathogen leaps from an animal host to a human one, became almost inevitable. Tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, influenza. All of them trace their origins to this era, to the intimate proximity between early farmers and their livestock. A 2007 study published in Nature by researchers including Mark Woolhouse at the University of Edinburgh estimated that over 60% of all known human infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. Your ancestors didn't just invent farming, they accidentally invented pandemics. So if early humans had no idea what was causing mass death, what did they actually do when it hit? The first answer is the one that surprises people the most. They ran, and running worked. Archaeologists studying Neolithic and Bronze Age settlement patterns have found something remarkable. Villages that were suddenly and completely abandoned, with no evidence of invasion, drought, or famine. Just gone. Everyone left. At the site of Hamakar in northeastern Syria, dating to around 3500 BCE, researchers found phases of abrupt abandonment that don't line up with any known conflict. People packed up and walked away from years of built infrastructure. Some researchers now believe that epidemic disease was a primary driver of these mysterious abandonments. Your ancestors couldn't name the sickness, but they could observe the pattern. People who stayed, died, people who left, sometimes didn't, so they voted with their feet. Here's what nobody tells you about this strategy. It actually mirrors one of the most effective modern pandemic responses: quarantine through geographic isolation. Your ancestors stumbled onto a version of social distancing thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked. They didn't have epidemiological models. They had observation, fear, and the instinct to survive. And sometimes that was enough. But not everyone ran. Some communities were too established, too invested in their land and grain stores to walk away. For them, the response was spiritual. And before you dismiss that, listen to what the spiritual response actually accomplished. In ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest written records we have of epidemic disease come from cuneiform tablets dating to roughly 1750 BCE, during the Old Babylonian period. These tablets describe something called a hand of the god, a divine punishment that could strike an individual or an entire city. The response wasn't passive prayer. It was aggressive ritual quarantine. Texts from Mari, an ancient city on the Euphrates in modern Syria, contain explicit instructions. When a woman in the palace fell ill with a disease called sibitu, her drinking cup was to be isolated, her chair was not to be used by anyone else, and she was to be physically separated from other members of the household. This wasn't superstition dressed up as medicine. This was infection control, articulated in the language of the sacred because that was the only language available. The Babylonians didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that sickness traveled between people who shared space and objects. They encoded that knowledge in religious law, which meant it was followed with absolute obedience. Think about that. In a world without microscopes, without any concept of a pathogen, without even a word for contagious, a Bronze Age civilization developed isolation protocols that a modern epidemiologist would recognize. They got the practice right, they just got the explanation wrong. And this pattern repeats everywhere you look. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE and one of the oldest medical documents ever found, contains references to pestilence and prescriptions for fumigation, the burning of specific herbs and resins to purify the air in a sick person's dwelling. In Vedic India, texts from roughly the same era describe the concept of krimi, tiny living agents of disease, centuries before anyone in Europe would begin thinking along similar lines. In ancient China, the Huangdi Neijing, compiled around the 2nd century BCE, contains detailed observations on how epidemics follow seasonal patterns and spread through populations. Every major civilization, independently, started building its own proto-theory of contagion. None of them were scientifically correct. All of them were observationally brilliant. Here's the part that should give you chills. Your ancestors were natural scientists without knowing it. They couldn't see the enemy, they couldn't test hypotheses, they couldn't culture bacteria in a lab, but generation after generation, they watched who died and who didn't, and they built rules around those observations. Don't drink from the same cup as a sick person. Burn the bedding. Leave the village if the dying starts. Stay away from corpses. Some of these rules were embedded in religion, some in taboo, some in folk wisdom passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The wrapper changed. The survival logic inside it didn't. But even observation and ritual couldn't explain the biggest horror of ancient pandemics, the randomness. Why did one person survive while the person sleeping next to them died? Why did some villages lose everyone while a settlement 10 miles away was untouched? This is the question that haunted the ancient world more than any other, and the answer they couldn't have known is the one that saved them most of all. Genetics. Your ancestors survived pandemics because the ones who didn't survive couldn't pass on their genes. This sounds brutal because it is. Every wave of disease that swept through a population killed disproportionately. the very young, the very old, and anyone whose immune system couldn't mount an effective defense. The survivors carried genetic advantages they didn't choose and couldn't understand. They simply lived, had children, and passed those advantages forward. In 2022, a landmark study published in Nature by a team led by geneticist Luis Barrero at the University of Chicago analyzed ancient DNA from remains buried before, during, and after the Black Death in London and Denmark. They found that individuals who survived the 1348 plague carried specific variants of immune genes, particularly a gene called ERAP2, at dramatically higher rates than those who died. The survivors weren't lucky. They were genetically equipped, and this wasn't unique to medieval Europe. The same evolutionary mechanism had been operating since the first epidemic hit the first human settlement. Every pandemic was a filter. Every generation of survivors was slightly better armed than the last. You are the product of thousands of years of this invisible selection. Every ancestor in your line lived long enough to reproduce. Every single one. That is not a small thing. Here's what it all comes down to. Ancient humans faced the first pandemics armed with almost nothing. No knowledge of what caused disease, no technology to treat it, no global infrastructure to coordinate a response. They faced pathogens that killed in days, that spread through the air, through water, through the animals they depended on for survival. And they didn't just die, they adapted. They ran when running could save them. They isolated the sick when instinct told them closeness meant death. They built entire religious and legal systems around hygiene rules they couldn't scientifically justify but could observationally verify. They fumigated, they quarantined, they burned what the dead had touched. They did all of this in the dark, working with pattern recognition and fear, and an unrelenting refusal to simply accept extinction. And underneath all of it, silently, invisibly, evolution was doing the heaviest lifting of all, sculpting the human immune system across millennia, one devastating outbreak at a time, shaping the biological machinery that still protects you right now, today, while you sit on your couch and scroll your phone and sip your coffee. The next time you get a sore throat and reach for that ibuprofen, understand what's behind that small, ordinary moment. Your immune system is an archive. It carries the memory of every plague your ancestors walked through, every epidemic that tried to end your genetic line and failed. You are not just alive, you are the answer to every pandemic that ever was. 10,000 years of invisible war, and you're still here,